I've always prided myself on being solitary, the kind who relishes the silence that comes with a day's hard work, especially in places where the buzz of the city fades into distant echoes. That's why I jumped at the opportunity when I landed a gig to repaint a sprawling manor tucked away in the mountains. The owner, an eccentric old man with more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, had one peculiar request. I was to work alone and stay in the manor during the job. The pay was generous and could clear my debts and keep me comfortable for months. How could I refuse? He gave me a specific order for the colors of his choice, which I bought and took. The drive to the manor was longer and more isolated than expected. Miles of winding roads bordered thick, enveloping forests. It was the kind of place where the canopy swallowed the sky and the air grew thick with the scent of pine and secrets. By the time I reached the estate gates, the sun was a mere whisper behind the mountains, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch and stir with a life of their own. The manor was a behemoth of stone and wood, old as the hills and twice as silent. It stood proud and lonely atop a slight rise, windows dark and yawning like the empty eye sockets of a skull. The old man greeted me at the door, his smile too broad, his handshake too firm. He gave me a brief tour, his cane echoing off the high ceilings and marble floors. He left soon after, muttering about a trip abroad and how the house needed a new coat to keep the spirits at bay. That first night, I set up my gear in the grand foyer, the walls hungry for color beneath years of neglect. I chose a rich, deep red for the main hall. Something about the shade felt fitting, almost as if the house whispered the choice to my ears. As night deepened, I worked by the light of several lamps, the shadows in the corners growing thicker, almost palpable. That first night, I set up my gear in the grand foyer, the walls hungry for color beneath years of neglect. I chose a rich, deep red for the main hall. Something about the shade felt fitting, almost as if the house whispered the choice to my ears. As night deepened, I worked by the light of several lamps, the shadows in the corners growing thicker, almost palpable. It was past midnight when I heard it, soft and slow footsteps pacing on the floor above. I paused, brushing in midair, straining my ears against the quiet. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time with a rhythm that mimicked my own heartbeat. Rational thought pushed me to dismiss it as the house settling, or maybe some small animal trapped inside. But the feeling in my gut, that primal, ancient instinct, screamed that something wasn't right. The next day, I found my paints upended, colors mixed and smeared across the drop cloth like a child's plaything. I spent hours cleaning up, cursing under my breath, convinced I must have knocked them over in some half-asleep blunder. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the manor grew cold and watchful, I couldn't shake the image of those footsteps or the sudden chill of feeling watched. That evening, I set up a small camera I had brought along to document my work, hoping to catch whatever or whoever was tampering with my supplies. What I captured chilled me to the bone. The footage was grainy, but in the flickering light of my temporary setup, I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, pausing in the doorway of the room, head cocked as if listening for the brushstrokes of my work. That night, sleep was a stranger. My thoughts spiraled around the ghostly image captured on camera, each creak and whisper of the house amplifying my unease. I tried convincing myself it was just a trick of the light, a fluke in the footage, but the stark fear when glimpsing that spectral figure was real. It was the kind of terror that clawed at the edges of my mind, urging me to flee. Yet, the job still needed to be done, and the payment was too substantial to abandon. The following morning, I explored the manor with a resolve bolstered by daylight's clarity. If I were to spend weeks here, I needed to know what lurked in the shadowed corners and behind the closed doors. The exploration led me through sprawling corridors, lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow my every move, their gazes piercing beneath layers of dust and age. I found journals in the library, an immense room with shelves stretching to a ceiling lost in shadow. They were the ramblings of the original owner, detailing life in the manor. As I leafed through the pages, a pattern emerged. Descriptions of unseen presences and whispers with no source filled the entries, dating back over a century. It seemed the manor had long been a home to something other than its inhabitants. The more I read, the more the air around me felt charged, heavy with anticipation. It was as if the house was reading over my shoulder, its breath cold on my neck. I left the library with more questions than answers, the words from the journal echoing in my mind, painting my daytime tasks with strokes of dread. As I resumed painting that evening, the sensation of being watched grew overwhelming. Turning quickly, hoping to glimpse whatever might be lurking, I found nothing but the vast, empty space of the hall. Yet, the feeling persisted, an intangible gaze as real as the paint on my brush. I decided to review the camera footage again, hoping for nothing but bracing for the worst. There it was again. The figure, clearer this time, its movements deliberate, almost curious. It roamed the room's edges, then paused, staring directly at the camera before vanishing as if it had never been there. This vision rattled me more than I cared to admit. That night, as a storm gathered with the wind howling like the cries of the damned, I fortified my resolve with a bottle of whiskey. The alcohol's warmth did little to stave off the chill that had nestled deep in my bones, or the fear that slithered through my veins like ice. The storm broke in a cacophony of thunder and lightning, the manor groaning under the weight of the torrential rain. In the chaos of the tempest, above the roar of the wind, I heard it. A sobbing, so forlorn and broken, it pierced the storm's fury. It was coming from the attic. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and ascended the narrow staircase to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, and the sobbing became louder and more desperate. As I reached the top, the flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the far corner where an old chest sat, dust-covered and forgotten. I approached the sobbing, now a whisper in my ear, so close I could almost feel the mourner's despair. Hands trembling, I opened the chest, the hinges screaming in protest. A doll lay inside a pile of old clothes and photographs. Its porcelain face was cracked, one eye missing, the other staring up with an expression of pure horror. The moment I touched it, the sobbing stopped, and the house fell silent, as if a held breath had been released. The silence that followed the cessation of the sobbing was almost suffocating. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the attic, there was a stillness that felt like it stretched across eons. Holding the doll, I felt an unexplainable sorrow, as if the very grief of the house had been woven into the porcelain. I couldn't understand why, but I felt compelled to return the doll downstairs. As I descended the steps, the doll's weight seemed to grow, as if it was absorbing the stale air of the attic, becoming heavier with each step. Back in my makeshift bedroom, I set the doll on a chair. One good eye watches me as I move around the room. I tried to resume painting to distract myself, but the brushstrokes felt mechanical, and my mind was consumed by the presence of the doll. That night, the boundaries between sleep and wakefulness blurred. I drifted into a restless slumber, plagued by dreams of the manor's past inhabitants. They whispered in hushed tones, lamenting tragedies long since past, their voices merging with the wind outside. In every dream, the doll appeared, its cracked face slowly repairing, its eye returning until it looked at me with unnerving completeness. I awoke to a cold dawn, the storm having spent its fury. The house was silent again, but it was deceptive, like the calm between breaths. I decided it was time to confront the history of the manor head-on. With the doll in tow, I returned to the library, determined to uncover anything related to it in the old journals. Hours passed as I pored over the dusty pages. Finally, I stumbled upon a passage that sent shivers down my spine. The journal spoke of a little girl, the beloved daughter of a past owner, who had died tragically young. Her favorite toy was a porcelain doll she cherished until her death. The family, crippled by grief, reported strange occurrences following her passing, sobbing sounds, objects moving on their own, and the perpetual cold in her rooms. As I read, the pieces of the haunting puzzle began to fall into place. The doll was not just an object, it was a vessel imbued with the residue of the past, a conduit for the sorrow that permeated the manor's walls. Determined to end the haunting, even though I found a ritual of release for the girl's spirit in the journals, I decided to seek more concrete help. Trusting in the weight of tradition and ceremony, I searched for the local priest, hoping a blessing might cleanse the house and its surroundings. The town, nestled at the mountain's base, was small, a huddled mass of buildings that had seen better days, their edges worn by time and weather. The church stood on the outskirts, an old stone structure with a steeple that cut into the sky like a promise. Its heavy oak doors creaked open with my push, echoing through the silent nave. I found the priest in the rectory, a small room cluttered with books and religious paraphernalia. He was an older man, his face etched with the lines of countless smiles and worries. When I told him about the manor and its spectral disturbances, his eyes flickered with a recognition that unnerved me. "Yes, the manor has long been a place of whispers," he said, his voice a soft rumble. "Many have sought my help before you. Some tales tell of peace found, others not so. But we shall try, my son, we shall try." The priest gathered his holy water and an old, worn Bible, and we drove back to the manor. The journey was quiet, with the only sounds being the gravel crunching under the car's tires and the occasional rustle of the priest flipping through his Bible, muttering prayers under his breath. As we approached the manor, the sky seemed to press down upon us, heavy with unshed rain. The house loomed, its windows like dark eyes, and its timbers groaning as if in greeting or warning. The priest began his blessing in the foyer, the incense from his thurible swathing the air in a scent that was at once musty and sacred. We moved from room to room, his chants echoing off the walls, filling the space with a palpable power. The air seemed to tremble, charged with silent energy, as if the house was listening, deciding whether to accept the benediction offered. When we reached the little girl's room, the priest paused, his face somber. "This is where it hurts most," he murmured before resuming his prayers with renewed vigor. He sprinkled holy water on the walls, the floor, and the tiny bed that lay untouched as if waiting for its owner to return. Finally, we stood outside under the house's looming shadow. The priest took a deep breath, closing his eyes as he delivered the final part of the blessing. The wind picked up, sweeping around us like a chorus of voices, and for a moment it felt as if the world held its breath. Then, just as quickly, the tension broke. The air lightened a subtle shift that felt like a sigh of relief. The priest opened his eyes, looking at the manor with a weary smile. "It is done," he said. "The rest is up to the house now to find peace." As he left, I stood watching the manor. The sense of being watched had dissipated, replaced by a quiet that felt empty and full. Whether the priest's efforts were successful or if the ritual had appeased the restless spirits, I couldn't say. But as I resumed work, the colors seemed brighter, the shadows less menacing, and for the first time since arriving, the manor felt a little like home. Reflecting back, I noticed something odd about the priest's behavior during the blessing. He deliberately avoided the basement. As we made our way through the manor, he walked briskly past the basement door each time we neared it, a brief flash of apprehension crossing his features, swiftly masked by a practiced calm. This didn't escape my notice, and it seeded a gnawing curiosity mixed with dread inside me. Once the priest had left, claiming his duties were complete and the house should find its own peace, I stood before the basement door. The house seemed quieter, the oppressive feeling lifted somewhat by the blessing, but the door stood like a dark question mark, challenging the completeness of our efforts. Compelled by a need to understand why the priest had shunned this part of the house, I grasped the cold doorknob, the metal biting into my palm as I turned it. The door creaked ominously, swinging open to reveal a staircase descending into darkness. The air from the depths was cooler, carrying a faint, musty odor that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I fetched a flashlight and descended, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. As I reached the bottom, the beam of my flashlight sliced through the darkness, revealing a sprawling basement cluttered with old furniture covered in dust sheets, boxes of forgotten belongings, and shadows that seemed to flicker just beyond the light's reach. The atmosphere was markedly different. It was as if the blessing's warmth hadn't penetrated this far. I wandered between the boxes and old furniture stacks, the flashlight casting eerie, dancing shadows against the walls. In the far corner, I noticed something unusual, a wall that seemed newer than the rest, the bricks too clean, the mortar too fresh. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I approached. Why would there be a newly built wall in an otherwise ancient basement? The question hammered in my mind as I inspected the wall more closely. There was no door, no entryway, just a flat, unyielding surface. Yet something about it felt deliberate, like it was meant to conceal rather than fortify. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was what the priest had been avoiding. The thought was unsettling, urging me to dig deeper. Returning upstairs, I rummaged through the manor's old tool shed until I found a hammer and chisel. Armed with determination and a pounding heart, I returned to the wall. Chipping away at the mortar, the sound of metal striking brick echoed through the basement like a clock chime, counting down to an unknown consequence. After hours, a piece of brick fell away, revealing a hollow space beyond. My hands trembled as I removed another brick, then another, slowly opening a gap large enough to peer through. The space beyond the wall was not just a hidden room, but a shrine. In the dim light of my flashlight, I could see walls lined with photographs, candles, and other odd trinkets. In the center, a small altar held an assortment of items that looked disturbingly like personal belongings: a child's shoe, a woman's comb, a man's wristwatch, each seemingly an artifact of someone's life. The realization hit me with a wave of nausea. The priest hadn't avoided the basement out of ignorance. He knew what was down here. He had known and chosen to keep it sealed, hidden from the world, and perhaps for a reason. Standing in the silence of the basement, surrounded by the echoes of past lives, I knew I had uncovered more than just a hidden room. I had uncovered secrets that perhaps were meant to stay buried. As I stood there, the flashlight beam quivering in my hand, I realized the gravity of what I had uncovered. The shrine in the hidden room was not merely a collection of forgotten belongings, but a memorial, a silent testament to lives that had once intertwined with the manor's somber history. The air felt thick with unspoken stories, each item on the altar whispering its sorrowful tale. The sudden rush of empathy for these unknown individuals was overwhelming, coupled with a chilling realization that their endings might not have been peaceful. The question that gnawed at my mind was whether these were tokens of remembrance or something darker, relics of untimely departures. Driven to understand, I returned to the library, where the journals are now more crucial than ever. Hours slipped by as I delved deeper into the handwritten pages, the old ink telling stories of the manor's past owners, the tragedies that befell their families, and the strange occurrences that seemed to follow. The journals hinted at disappearances, grief that turned into an obsession, and a pattern of misfortune that painted a grim picture of the manor's legacy. Among the faded entries, one story stood out, a tale from many decades ago about the owner. This reclusive man was rumored to conduct seances in an attempt to contact his deceased family members. The community had whispered about his madness, how grief had driven him to the brink of the occult. It was his belongings, his rituals that filled the hidden shrine. I needed to make a decision. The knowledge I now possessed felt like a burden, each piece of the shrine's puzzle adding weight to my responsibility. Could I simply seal the wall again and pretend none of this existed? Or was there a way to rectify the past, to give peace to the spirits that might still linger? Determined to find closure, I contacted the priest again, confronting him with what I had seen. When I finished recounting my discoveries, he was silent for a long time. Finally, he agreed to return, his voice heavy with a resignation that suggested he, too, was caught in the manor's tangled web of history. We stood in the basement together, the priest looking over the shrine somberly. This was meant to be sealed forever, he confessed. The man believed he could bind the spirits to these objects, keep them close. It was misguided, dangerous even. But now, we must set things right. He began a ritual different from the blessing he had performed before. This was specific, an old rite meant to release any spirits bound to the earthly realm. As he chanted in Latin, the air around us grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stir. When the ritual was complete, a palpable sense of release filled the air. The heaviness blanketing the basement lifted as if a long-held breath had been exhaled. The priest and I exchanged looks, a mutual understanding that what had been done here was necessary, though fraught with risk. In the days that followed, the manor felt truly peaceful, as if it too had been holding on to the grief and now was finally free. I finished my painting job, the colors seeming to apply easier, as if the walls themselves were more willingly accepting the change. As I packed up to leave, taking one last look at the manor, I felt relief and sorrow. I had come to paint a house, but had instead navigated through its past, uncovering secrets that were as dark as they were poignant. The manor would continue standing, its stories now part of my own, a reminder of the thin veil between past and present. If you enjoyed this eerie tale and are curious about my experience converting an old asylum into a hotel, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support will shine a light on these dark corners of history and my journey through them. Stay tuned for more stories that blur the lines between the past and the present, where every hallway and room whispers secrets of what once was. Your engagement helps bring these stories to life and invites more thrilling adventures. So, remember to hit that subscribe button and join me as we uncover more chilling mysteries together.